George Harrison smiled for the cameras, but behind the scenes, one person made his life a living hell. 4 years, this Beatles bandmate controlled every note George played, mocked his spiritual beliefs, and treated him like a servant. In 1969, George finally snapped and walked out of the studio. But that wasn't the worst part. What this person did during George's darkest moments crossed every line of friendship. The betrayal was so deep that George carried the anger until his final breath. Today, we're revealing the shocking truth about the Beatle George Harrison truly hated more than anyone. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in a tiny house at 12 Arnold Grove, Liverpool. The night he was born, the city was under its 78th straight night of bombing. His father, Harold, earned just £3 a week as a bus conductor, working 14-hour shifts and walking miles to save on bus fare. George shared a bed with his brothers until he was 16. His mother, Louise, worked nights cleaning offices, earning only a couple of shillings per building. Their food budget for the whole week was just 15 shillings. Yet somehow, Louise made their little home warm and full of hope. In 1955, when George was 12, he was cycling past a house when he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel playing through an open window. He stopped, frozen, and listened to the entire song. That moment changed everything. Elvis's sound, especially the echo on the guitar, lit a fire in George. He rushed home and told his mother he needed a guitar more than food. From then on, music took over his life. At 14, George finally got his first guitar. He walked all the way to Frank Hess's music shop to get a cheap Eggman flat top for £3.10. It was painful to play, and his fingers bled for weeks, but he practiced 6 to 8 hours a day. He learned Rock Island Line first and soon stopped caring about school altogether. He failed almost every subject except art. His teacher even wrote that George cared more about guitars than geometry. That same year, George met Paul McCartney. They were on the number 86 bus to Liverpool when Paul noticed George's guitar. George told him he could play 20 Flight Rock, which was no easy task. Paul was impressed. Soon after, George auditioned for Paul's band, the Quarrymen. He played raunchy perfectly, even though he was just 14 years and 364 days old. John Lennon didn't want to add someone so young, but George's talent couldn't be denied. He became the youngest member of what would become the most famous band in history. The Harrison family supported George in ways that most people wouldn't believe. Louise picked up a third job cleaning the Cavern Club to help pay for his music needs. Harold let George ride the bus for free, even though he could have lost his job for it. When George needed a better guitar, they sold their piano. When the band had their first paid gig, Louise even pawned her wedding ring so they could rent an amplifier. Every penny went toward George's dream. One key moment came when Paul McCartney froze during a performance and couldn't play his solo. The band realized they needed a proper lead guitarist. Paul pushed hard for George, but Lennon wasn't sure. George was still a kid. Eventually, Paul wore him down. They arranged a second audition on a double-decker bus outside Wilson Hall. George played raunchy again, and Lennon finally agreed. Later research showed George had actually joined by December 7, 1957, even earlier than most people thought. From the beginning, Lennon treated George more like a little brother than an equal. The 3-year age gap was a big deal back then. George's ideas were often ignored, and he felt like he wasn't being taken seriously. Over time, that tension only grew. During the Let It Be sessions in 1969, George exploded. He told Lennon he wasn't happy and left the band for a while. Lennon even talked about bringing in Eric Clapton as a replacement. George later said he felt pushed out, especially after Yoko Ono entered Lennon's life. When George joined the Quarrymen, the band was already falling apart. Most of the original members left soon after. They kept changing names, Johnny and the Moondogs, J-Pitch 3, Long John and the Silver Beatles, before finally landing on the Beatles in 1960. George's arrival also marked a shift in their sound. They went from skiffle to real rock and roll. He and Paul added pickups to their guitars and bought an Elpico amp, giving the group their first electric edge. George's technical skills helped shape the early Beatles sound. Then came Hamburg, a brutal test of survival. In 1960, they were booked at the Kaiser Keller. They played 8 hours a day, stretching songs for as long as possible just to fill time. The club owner demanded they perform like wild animals. George was just 17. Their living space was behind the stage, filthy and shared with other bands. They barely slept. The club bouncer was a former boxer who had killed someone in a street fight. It was rough, but it made them professionals. On February 9, 1964, something unforgettable happened on American television. 73 million people tuned in to watch the Beatles perform on The Ed Sullivan Show. That was over 60% of every TV turned on in the country that night. CBS had received 50,000 ticket requests, even though the studio only had 728 seats. Back in 1957, Elvis Presley's debut only brought in 7,000 requests. That night, Ed Sullivan hit his highest ratings in 7 years with a 45.3 rating and a 60 share. Even Richard Nixon's daughters, Julie and Tricia, were in the audience. The Beatles played 5 songs: All My Loving, Till There Was You, She Loves You, I Saw Her Standing There, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. As they sang, each of their names appeared on the screen. When John Lennon came up, the text read, "Sorry girls, he's married." That moment didn't just entertain, it set off Beatlemania across America and launched what would be known as the British invasion. It changed pop culture forever. A few months before that big moment, George Harrison had already taken his first step toward songwriting. It was August 1963. He was stuck in bed with an illness at the Palace Court Hotel in Bournemouth. A doctor told him to rest and gave him tonic. Bored and with nothing to do, Harrison picked up a tape recorder and began messing around. He later said it was just to see if he could write a song at all. That effort became Don't Bother Me. In one surviving recording, he's heard working on the bridge and whistling the melody because the words weren't ready yet. A journalist from Liverpool, Bill Harry, said he'd pushed Harrison to write something. Harrison had snapped back, "Don't bother me," and that line became the song title. Years later, Harrison said the song wasn't very good and might not even count as a real song, but it proved something important. It showed him he could write, and he just needed to keep trying. The track appeared on with the Beatles later that year and marked the first time George contributed a song to a Beatles album. But even after that, Harrison hit a wall. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney were writing almost every song on each album, George was often limited to just 2 songs per record. From 1965 on, this rule stayed in place. It created tension that built up for years. In 2022, Paul admitted there had been an unspoken rule. He and John had made an early agreement that they would be the ones writing songs. Paul said, "We never said, let's keep George out of it, but it was implied." George found it hard to get the band to even record his songs. Lennon, McCartney, and their producer, George Martin, didn't fully respect his work until near the end of the Beatles' run. It wasn't until 1969 that Paul finally said, "Now this year, his songs are at least as good as ours." Media attention didn't help either. Each Beatle was given a label. Lennon was the smart one, Paul was the cute one, George was the quiet one, and Ringo was the lucky one. That's how the public saw them. From 1964 to 1970, the Beatles had the top-selling single in America 1 out of every 6 weeks and the top-selling album 1 out of every 3 weeks. They were the first pop group since Buddy Holly to release a full album of original songs when A Hard Day's Night came out in July 1964. But the fame mostly centered on John and Paul. Their names were in every headline, and their partnership was what people talked about. George's role, even though it shaped the band's sound in huge ways, often got overlooked. Around 1965, the pressure and limitations began to wear on him. That same year, he started experimenting with Indian music and also had his first LSD trip. In March, the Beatles met Swami Vishnudevananda and were given a copy of the complete illustrated book of yoga. Later that summer, during a visit to Elvis Presley, Harrison learned about yoga. Though he didn't take much interest at first, by the end of 1966, things had changed. He was reading Vivekananda and Yogananda more seriously. He wasn't just curious, he was looking for something deeper. In summer 1967, he and John spent hours chanting the Hare Krishna mantra while on LSD in Greece. By August, all 4 Beatles went to see Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, which led to their famous trip to Rishikesh in 1968. For George, these weren't just spiritual hobbies, they were a way to deal with the pressure and find peace when he felt invisible within the band. In April 1965, while filming Help at Twickenham Studios, Harrison had a moment that changed everything. In one scene, Indian musicians were playing in the background. While everyone waited between takes, George picked up a sitar out of curiosity. He thought the sound was strange, but something about it stuck with him. Around the same time, bands like the Yardbirds and the Kinks were releasing songs with Indian-style influences. But George took it further. While the rest of the band was getting high during filming, George was focused on something else. He was finding a sound that no other guitarist had. The sitar would become his signature. A year later, in June 1966, Harrison met Ravi Shankar at the home of Ayana Deva Angadi. It wasn't just a friendly meeting. Within 3 months, George and Ravi had both cleared their schedules to travel across India together for 6 weeks. Usually, students had to wait years to learn from Shankar, but he agreed to teach George almost right away. Shankar said George asked questions constantly and seemed deeply interested in both Indian music and religion. At first, Ravi thought the sitar part on Norwegian would sounded strange, but he realized George wasn't just playing around. Their connection felt like fate. On October 12, 1965, George recorded that sitar part for Norwegian wood. It was the first time an Indian instrument had ever been used in a Western pop song. He bought the sitar on Oxford Street in London. It came from a music shop in Kolkata. George said it happened quickly. He found the right notes, they fit the song, and that was it. That simple moment changed the direction of rock music. The song kicked off the short-lived raga rock trend and inspired a wave of sitar use in pop songs. Years later, that same sitar was sold at auction for $62,500. The bidding had started at $50,000. George had given it away during his honeymoon in Barbados to a friend of his wife, Pattie Boyd. But not everyone in the band was thrilled with his growing love for Indian music. In 1968, the Beatles went to India to study with the Maharishi. Harisson wanted to meditate and focus. Paul had a different plan. He kept writing songs for what would become the White Album. It led to a serious clash. Paul later said, "George actually once got quite annoyed and told me off because I was trying to think of the next album." George fired back, "We're not here to do the next album. We're here to meditate." That moment showed the deep difference between them. Paul liked to work non-stop. George waited for inspiration. Paul thought George's spiritual focus might be risky or even a little silly. George thought Paul didn't understand what really mattered. George Harrison was always called the quiet Beatle, but behind that quiet image was a storm brewing for years. In 1966, George finally got his moment. On the Revolver album, he wrote not just one, but 3 songs, Taxman, which opened the entire record, Love You Too, and I Want to Tell You. This was a big deal. Until then, he had barely been allowed to contribute. But the moment he stepped forward, the others pushed him back again. When they began working on Sgt. Pepper's later that year, George brought a song called Only a Northern Song. It was critical of how songwriting credits and money were handled in the band. Lennon and McCartney didn't just reject it, they made sure he only got one song on the album. Paul later said George just didn't show much interest, but that wasn't the truth. George was shut out. He later called the whole album experience boring. He ended up recording Within You Without You alone. Literally, he was the only Beatle in the studio that day. Indian musicians came in to help, but not John, not Paul, not Ringo. Even when the track was finished with strings added by George Martin, the others still didn't bother to show up. It was the first time a Beatles song had been created without any involvement from the rest of the band. Lennon later said it was one of George's best songs, but at the time, he hadn't even cared enough to attend. Paul's attitude made things worse. He openly made fun of George's interest in Indian music and spirituality. George was diving deep into Hinduism, reading Vedic texts, and learning the sitar. Paul would roll his eyes, crack jokes, and leave the room during George's sessions. George felt mocked. He once said, "They didn't even try to understand what I was bringing." That hurt deeply. It wasn't just music anymore, it was spiritual, and they treated it like a joke. Everyone said the Beatles worked like a democracy, but that was never true. Lennon and McCartney controlled everything. George got 1 or 2 songs per album while they filled the rest. Even when George had better songs, they were sidelined. He didn't even own his publishing like they did. He was paid less, credited less, and heard less. Bob Dylan once said, George had to fight to get anything on the records. And it was true. He wasn't treated like an equal, he was treated like an assistant. By 1967, George had a pile of songs the others wouldn't even listen to. All Things Must Pass was one of them. He brought it to the Let It Be sessions. Lennon and McCartney laughed it off, said it didn't fit. That same session was full of tension. George even gave the song to Billy Preston at one point just to get it away from them. When he released it himself 3 years later, it became a classic. So did My Sweet Lord, and Isn't It a Pity? Even Not Guilty, which they attempted over 100 times before giving up. Those songs proved he had been right all along. Then came the breaking point. On January 10, 1969, George walked out. Cameras were rolling at Twickenham Studios. The band was rehearsing Get Back. Paul kept nitpicking his guitar playing. It wasn't new, George had taken it for a week. But that day, something snapped. He left without making a scene. Just said he was done. Later that night, he wrote in his diary like it was a normal day, went home, recorded another song. 8 chips. 4 days earlier, he had reached his limit on camera. Paul had been telling him how to play again. George just looked at him and said calmly, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." That moment, filmed and archived forever, showed just how much he had been pushed. It wasn't angry, it was resigned. That's what made it so powerful. That same night he quit, George went home and wrote Wah Wah. The title meant 2 things, it was a guitar effect, but it was also a headache. That's how he described the band. He recorded it for his solo album, loud, sharp, confident. He didn't even offer it to the Beatles when he came back 5 days later. Instead, he gave them I Me Mine. He had decided the best of his songs would be for himself. At home, things were no better. His wife, Pattie Boyd, said George would come back from the studio angry and miserable. The arguments were constant. She saw how much it changed him. She said George didn't even like Paul's personality. They barely spoke. He was trying to find peace through spirituality, but the Beatles were tearing him apart. When he agreed to return, it was only after serious conditions. He made them move sessions from Twickenham to Apple Studios. He cancelled the planned live TV concert. And most importantly, he demanded more chances to contribute his songs. They had to promise. It was humiliating. John even joked they'd just get Eric Clapton if George didn't come back. That hurt, but he came back anyway, because he still cared, at least for a little while. But nothing really changed. The damage was done. One of the most painful moments came during the recording of Hey Jude. George tried to add guitar riffs after Paul's vocal lines. Paul told him to stop, said it didn't fit. George stayed silent, but later Paul admitted it was insulting. He said George was one of the greats, and he still had to tell him to back off. That's how far things had fallen. Then came Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Paul loved the song. The others hated it. They spent 4 days recording it, 16 takes on the first day alone. John skipped the sessions. Ringo called it the worst recording experience of his life. George said it was fruity and awful, but they did it anyway because Paul wanted it. Finally, in late 1969, George got a win. His song Something was released as a double A-side with Lennon's Come Together. It was the first time George had ever received equal billing. He told a reporter, "Big deal, eh?" The song hit #1 in the US. Lennon even said it was the best track on Abbey Road, but it had taken too long. George had been writing songs like that for years, they just didn't listen. On his solo album All Things Must Pass, George released Run of the Mill. It was aimed at Paul. The title was a play on words, but the meaning was sharp. George talked about the mess at Apple, how Paul kept saying everyone else was useless, how he blamed others for everything. The lyrics were honest, even sad, but they didn't hold back. By 1974, George was ready to say it out loud. In an interview, he said Paul had ruined his confidence as a guitar player, said he didn't know if he was good or bad anymore. Another musician in Paul's band had quit for the same reason. George wasn't just angry, he was wounded. He had spent years being told how to play, what to play, and when to play it. Meanwhile, his marriage to Pattie Boyd in 1966 looked like a fairy tale. They had met on the set of A Hard Day's Night, and by all appearances, George had found his muse. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. By 1970, his best friend, Eric Clapton, was secretly in love with Pattie. He wrote her desperate letters and even composed Layla to win her over. Pattie showed one of the letters to George, thinking it was from a fan. It wasn't, it was from the man George often invited into their home. The triangle dragged on for years. George and Pattie finally divorced in 1977. 2 years later, she married Clapton. That marriage also ended in heartbreak. Years later, the letters Clapton wrote sold at auction for $3.6 million. Then came an even deeper betrayal. George had an affair with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. He didn't try to hide it. At a dinner party, he looked Ringo in the eye and said, "I'm in love with your wife." Ringo, trying to stay calm, replied, "Better you than someone we don't know." But the real explosion came when Pattie caught them together in a locked bedroom at George's estate. She stood outside shouting. George laughed. John Lennon, hearing about it later, called it virtual incest. The result? Both marriages collapsed in 1975. 2 Beatles families torn apart by one man's choices. What made it more shocking was George's public image. He spoke about peace, faith, and enlightenment. But the people around him described a man full of anger, jealousy, and lust. His second wife, Olivia, tried to be diplomatic, saying George just loved women. Ringo put it bluntly, George was a bag of beads and a bag of anger. He dated only supermodels. He cheated constantly. He claimed to be searching for spiritual truth but kept falling into cocaine binges and emotional outbursts. Friends said it was like dealing with two different people. George's drug use wasn't limited to the Beatles' early psychedelic days. It went far beyond that. He took his first LSD trip in 1965 after a dentist slipped it into his drink without warning. That experience changed him forever, but it also led him down a path of deeper dependency. In the 1970s, he was smoking up to 4 packs of cigarettes a day and using cocaine regularly. Yet, even as he struggled with his own addictions, he warned Elton John to stay off the marching powder. He could lecture others but couldn't stop himself. And while he claimed to reject materialism, George surrounded himself with luxury. His estate, Friar Park, wasn't just a home, it was a palace with 120 rooms and sprawling gardens. He collected exotic cars and only dated women the tabloids called goddesses. His songs told fans to let go of their ego, but his life told a different story. Even when he traveled to India, it wasn't as a humble seeker, it was as a rock star with VIP treatment. The title of his 1973 album, Living in the Material World, captured the conflict. He was stuck between two lives. But just when people started to see him as a hypocrite, George pulled off one of the greatest musical comebacks ever. In 1970, he released All Things Must Pass, a triple album that didn't just do well, it crushed the charts. It hit #1 in both albums and singles. Lennon and McCartney couldn't match that at the time. The album sold millions, earned gold and platinum certifications, and critics called it the war and peace of rock and roll. George had been limited to 2 songs per Beatles record, now he was proving he could carry 3 albums by himself. He didn't stop there. In 1971, George joined John Lennon on the song, How Do You Sleep? A brutal attack on Paul McCartney. George's slide guitar cut through the track as John tore into Paul's ego and music. Even Ringo showed up during the session and tried to calm them down. But George stayed, playing through the tension. He later said it was a strange time full of intense feelings. That same year, George organized something no rock star had ever done before, a massive benefit concert for a foreign crisis. The concert for Bangladesh was held at Madison Square Garden with 2 sold-out shows and a total of 40,000 people in the crowd. The lineup included Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Billy Preston, Leon Russell, and even Ringo. Paul McCartney refused to attend. George raised nearly $12 million by 1985 through album and film sales. It was the first concert of its kind and showed the world that George wasn't just a songwriter, he could move mountains for a cause. But behind the scenes, the Beatles were collapsing into legal war. When McCartney sued the others in December 1970, Harisson, Lennon, and Starr united to fight back. They submitted affidavits insisting the band could still go on. It was a strategic lie, they knew it was over, but they didn't want Paul to win outright. The court sided with McCartney. The band's assets were frozen and eventually divided. Harisson had chosen his side, and it wasn't Paul's. Years later, the wound still hadn't healed. At the 1988 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, Paul didn't show up. Ringo had reportedly had too much to drink. That left George to accept the honor alone. His speech tried to smooth things over, saying they all loved John and Paul. But the message was clear, the Beatles were honored as legends, but still broken as friends. Then came the night everything changed. George passed away on November 29, 2001, in that house. He was 58 years old. His last words to the world came through Olivia and Donnie, everything else can wait, but the search for God cannot wait. That had always been George's true calling. Through all the drama, all the heartbreak, and all the contradictions, he never stopped trying to find peace.